Now, perhaps we can open it up to you folks and ask us questions, things that you have on your mind that maybe we can try to answer. Yes, well, we can restate the question for those of you who don't hear it.
And we have 2 microphones on the floor that we'll pass around.
My question is this. If in your statement a while ago you mentioned that sort of the concept of virtual representation sort of was back in the mist of time, the idea that it could be represented.
The source of English House of Commons, yes.
Okay, so as that comes forward and the colonies are formed, the colonists are coming from that same ethos, that idea of virtual representation. What actually allows the colonies to go through a metamorphosis to the point where they no longer think that Parliament has any say at all? I mean, is it because of the period of salutary neglect?
No, there's a century of experience creating new districts, if you will, new electoral districts. And that experience sort of reverses English history. They go back to the kind of medieval origins. Every time there's a new town created in Massachusetts, they say, okay, this town's, and we're talking 1630s, 40s, 50s, you're going to have 2 representatives in this general court. And the same is true in Virginia. And so that experience over 100 years just reverses the English experience, which has, England started with residential requirements for its representatives. It had a coherent, going back to the 14th, 15th centuries, the origins of Parliament. But by the 17th century, these origins have been lost, and the residential requirements have long since fallen away. Even if they exist on the books, they've fallen away. So the American experience, I think, is what leads them to this, what they call actual representation. It's almost inconceivable to most of them, this notion of virtual. Daniel Delaney, one of the participants from Maryland, does agree with virtual representation in his pamphlet opposing the Stamp Act, but what he disagrees, in other words, the notion that women and children and young men without property are represented is a kind of virtual representation. They don't vote, but they're represented. So he agrees with that virtual representation is okay as long as there's a mutuality of interest. But where he disagrees, he says there's no mutuality of interest between us, colonists, and the British. And that right away, there's a sense of 2 nations, 2 people emerging in Delaney's pamphlet. That's the beginning of if you expand it out, because at the outset, they don't talk about being Americans. The term Americans is the one that Whitehall in London is using about the colonists, kind of associating with savages. In fact, when General Howe comes into harbor in June of 1776 with a bunch of Hessian soldiers, they're stunned to find that there are white people in New York City. Because the popular image is that a mongrel people, mixed of Indians, natives, and black slaves, and that the whites have somehow disappeared. So the popular image of the New World is really quite strange. Now there were people who knew better, but that I think is an interesting fact.
Can I just add something to that? I think everything that Gordon says about the experience of the Americans and West Indians, it should be said, is absolutely right. But in addition to that, there's the effect that there's an explosion of the press in Britain, in North America, in the West Indies, and even in Bombay and Madras in the period from 1730 to the period we're talking about. So basically, before that time, the press was heavily dominated by London newspapers. So what people read in the colonies, what people read in Edinburgh, what people read in Bombay were all London newspapers. There's an explosion of the press during this period. And at the same time, after 1744, when Henry Pelham becomes Prime Minister of England, the government decides that they're going to have, instead of having partisan government, that is to say, government with a single party ruling, there's coalition governments where you have people from different governments. And Pelham, as Prime Minister, says, if we do this, if we have all the smartest people from all the parties together, we don't need to deal with the press. We don't need to advertise our positions with the press. We should govern as technocrats and do what's best for the country. The result of that is from the 1740s onwards, the press everywhere takes the patriot position. And the patriot position from the 1740s in the press is in part about arguing against the unrepresentativeness of the Constitution. And there's a critique of virtual representation, which is in a lot of these newspapers which get republished, and the articles are reprinted from them in the colonial newspapers, which are now in existence in Jamaica too. So it's the experience, but it's also the fact that the press is overwhelmingly a patriot press, a self-described patriot press, which has a coherent critique of virtual representation really from the 1740s onwards. And I think
that's right. I mean, there's a growing gap in Great Britain between what you might call the populace and the government. The government maintains control, and of course, once the French Revolution occurs, then it's reinforced. In fact, to follow up a point you made earlier about the sense of mobbing that's going on everywhere, when they read about it in the colonies, North's government itself is suffering from mobs. He's almost killed at the doorsteps of the House of Commons by a mob. And so there's a sense that, I think in the English government, that the whole world is somehow coming apart. Isn't that part of the context for this? And I think that helps explain the context for the coercive acts. We've got to come down hard now, or everything will be lost.
I think that's absolutely right. And so what ends up happening, I mean, the result of the Tea Party, as it's reported in London, is to strip away some of the friends of the Americans. I mean, that is to say, their position up until then was the Americans are making coherent economic arguments against unreasonable and economically incoherent measures. So their view is, the friends of the Americans up until then is, look, we need to think about the British imperial economy as a whole. We want to have American consumers. It doesn't make sense to tax them with the Townsend duties. It doesn't make sense to do any of that. But then when the Tea Party happens, when they throw low-priced tea, which isn't hurting any consumption, into Boston Harbor, and the violence of that makes it much easier for North's government to say, no, you're wrong. You thought this was an economic argument. This is obviously something else. These are mobs just like the people attacking me.
I mean, there is a real, and Steve has pointed this out, a growth of a radical element in England that is greater than the government than the government's actions would suggest. In fact, after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, there's a group of raising money for the victims of British oppression in Lexington and Concord. Sort of the Jane Fonda types are in England opposing the British government. And of course, that really just adds to the fear of the establishment, if you will, that things are coming apart. So there is a strong movement within England that doesn't really fulfill itself until the 19th century, largely, I think, because of the French Revolution, makes everyone in England uptight about radicalism and about revolution. How about some other questions? Yes.